Good morning, everyone. So this is silly, but I am doing a digital lecture, essentially, and this is what we're going to have to do the rest of the semester, or at least for until, I don't know, things calm down. So I guess get used to this format. I'm going to try and do it via video, which I think, like, maintains some normalcy, because at least, I don't know, it feels more like a real in-person class and not an online class. So I guess just to, like, address the whole coronavirus situation, it's like things are stressful, and I guess I would just remind you that just because you're healthy and you have a healthy immune system doesn't mean you're not going to give it to someone who's older or has like an immune deficiency or anything. So just be careful, take care of everyone around you as well as yourself. So let's see, today we're talking about modernism. So I should also let you know that all of my neighbors decided to start weed whacking at like the exact moment that I did this, so there are going to be weed whacking sounds in the background, so sorry. Alright, so modernism is generally considered to be a movement that was bookended by the two world wars, and it was a time of great social and like societal, political, etc. upheaval, and people felt very very lost, very alienated. There was a lot going on that people had never experienced in the world before. So for example, World War I contributed to a real loss of faith in structures of authority, because young men were told on the one hand that this would be like a valiant cause, that they should sign up, that they were going to fight for their country, that it was noble and good to die for one's country, and then the reality of that war was these like awful trenches that people found themselves in, just terrible conditions, really like nightmarish and apocalyptic feeling for those who were in the war. And when they came back, obviously there was no real understanding of like PTSD or how mental illness worked. So a lot of young men were coming back from that war with what they called shell shock, and no one really knew how to deal with that effectively and how to help them get through that. Other things that were going on. So the Industrial Revolution continued to revolutionize things. So technology was increasing. Cars were invented in this time period. There was also a lot of anxiety about like changing demographics in the country, which you see this like again and again throughout history. So in 1924, for example, Congress put in place a lot of immigration restrictions. It prohibited all immigration from Asia and also set quotas for other countries at 2% of their existing U.S. immigrant populations in 1890. So the very explicit idea of these policies was to restore the whiteness of the nation, basically. So a lot of xenophobia at this time as well. In 1920, women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And there was also a lot going on with like the Soviet Revolution, which we'll talk about in a minute. In 1929, as you all probably know what happened that year, the stock market crashed, and we found ourselves in the Great Depression, which had global implications. So modernism's idea was that old forms could not work for new times. So everything was new to people. And there was, as I just said, this push back against the newness, and then on the other hand, there was a lot of people really embraced that newness. Like, so for example, women had never really gotten the chance to have a lot of freedoms that men had always had, particularly sexual freedoms. And in the 1920s, they were able to be a little more liberated. If you think about like the flapper dress, that was a lot more comfortable than wearing like petticoats all the time. Women generally stopped wearing corsets. And some other things that happened at this time were Freud began publishing. And up until now, people had never really thought about the idea that your mind, well, Emily Dickinson had, but most people had not really thought about the idea that your mind might be something that you not only couldn't control, but also like had no, like, there were parts of your mind that you actually couldn't like access, right? So Freud, he came up with the idea of an unconscious, and his idea of the mind was that we had an id, which is like your unconscious desires, and an ego, which is like yourself, and a superego, which is like your highest self, like your goals and values and stuff like that. And Freudian psychology focused especially on the way in which the unconscious was shaped by like childhood like sexual desires and like repressed sexuality. And that's not really still necessarily accepted in psychoanalysis as being like the main force for, you know, what shapes your unconscious. But it was very nerve-wracking to people in society to be told, like, you know, hey, like you don't know yourself, and also like you have like repressed desires that like come from your childhood, and you need to go to psychotherapy to access those, and then I don't know, it's stressful for people. So the very nature of the self was being questioned. According to, let's see, we also had Einstein, sorry, Albert Einstein's general and special theories of relativity were around this time. So the understanding of reality itself was changing. So people learned that, for example, the universe was both infinite in size and infinitely expanding. And that was also stressful for people because, you know, if you're, as you guys know, like if you sort of look around, if you look at the sky, if you look at like the world, a lot of these scientific theories that we now know to generally be the truth about the universe and its infiniteness, that's not common sense. Like that doesn't really match with the way reality looks when we are just in reality looking around us. So there were a lot of truths being revealed at this time that were not only new, but were also counterintuitive. So that created a lot of, I guess, unrest. In 1917, the communist revolution in Russia took place. So it was led by Lenin. They overthrew the Tsarist regime, instituted Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat, and developed communism as a unified international movement. So many Americans were actually like very sympathetic to this. Communist ideas and Marxist ideas in particular influenced a lot of like the labor movement and influenced agitation for, you know, workers' rights, like the 8-hour workday and stuff like that, like better pay, higher minimum wage, stuff we still see people working for today. Although Americans who were involved in the Communist Party were often like surveyed by the government. So it was definitely seen as a threat to the status quo in the United States. All right, so mass popular culture was also rising in prominence at this time. And one of your discussion questions is about this. I'm going to check if anybody's answered those yet so I could respond to them. Seems like maybe no. guess not yet. So if you do respond, I'll answer in this video. Okay, so as one of the questions mentions, I want you guys to be thinking a little bit about the difference between like high art and mass culture, because at this time, the increase in technology really brought mass culture to the people. So we got the radio, especially, and many intellectuals, according to the book, suspected that mass culture would create a robotic, passive population vulnerable to demagoguery. So demagoguery is basically just like tyranny. And I guess I wonder if this is true, because I think in many ways we are living in a time period that the modernists sort of, what's the word for it? Like they saw it in the future. It's what they imagined the future might be like in many ways. And many of these forces still inform our society today, right? Like we still talk all the time about the role of technology, the role of science versus religion, the role of what else? Popular culture. So I guess I think it's interesting to kind of ask, you know, like how popular culture informs society today. Like, has it made us stupid? Has it made us passive? Has it made us vulnerable to demagoguery? Or are there some ways in which popular culture is actually like really useful and good? And like, how do we draw that line, I guess? So that is my elaboration on your discussion question for when you do get to them. All right. Oh, and the other thing I should mention is the car, because we are going to be reading part of On the Road as well as Imogen Binny's Nevada. After the car was invented, the open road became, and still is, as you probably know, a really important symbol of like American liberty, like the American experience. You know, the road novel is a very important part of later American literature, which we're gonna talk about that later. Let's see, the 1930s. So the Great Depression happened in the 1930s, and this, okay, I'll just read from what the book says, because I think this is a really good way of putting it. Free enterprise capitalism had always justified itself by arguing that the system not only made a small number of individuals immensely wealthy, but also guaranteed better lives for all. So this is kind of trickle-down economics, if you're familiar. Oh, that's my cat. So the Great Depression really showed the falsehood of this claim, right? So it showed that free market capitalism at its worst could also lead to a situation where you have very, very, very wealthy people completely like screwing everyone below them, and suddenly people who had been working class found themselves unable to put food on the table. And this was, you know, really significant. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected in 1932 to basically, I mean, obviously what people wanted him to do was end the Great Depression, and he instated some liberal reforms such as Social Security, the Works Progress Administration, which created jobs in the public sector, welfare, unemployment insurance, a lot of things that people would call somewhat socialist. And by doing that, he was able to sort of cushion society from the worst effects. Oh my, okay, sorry. From the worst effects of the Great Depression. Are you gonna? Okay. My cat is Oscar. Get down. Okay. But the Great Depression did not fully end until we entered World War II. So time and again, you'll also see that like when the nation enters into a war, it's really good for the economy, because there's like a lot of stuff you have to make for war. And things that, yeah, I mean, it puts people to work, basically. So World War II was what like really ended the Great Depression. Let's see. Other things that were going on at the time was the rise of fascism. So obviously in Germany, but another really important place where fascism was coming into power was in Spain. So many communists, what am I trying to say? So many left-wing activists actually went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War to fight on the side of the communists against Franco, who was a fascist. And let's see. After World War II started, many believed the USSR would be the only country able to withstand the German war machine, as the book says. But unfortunately, that is actually kind of true about World War II. I don't think it's often argued that, we wouldn't have won World War II if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. But eventually, starting in 1936, Stalin began instituting brutal purges, and in 1939, he promised not to go to war against Germany. I'm even thinking of World War I. Forget what I said about the war. That might have been World War I. Can't remember. I'm not good at history, as I told you. Alright, so it was very upsetting for a lot of left-wing activists and people who had associated themselves with the Communist Party and with Marxism in general to see that the really brutal realities of communism under Joseph Stalin, and specifically the way in which Marx's idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, which for Marx was something that would eventually undo itself in theory, how in practice that just became a dictatorship, period. So that was a problem. All right, so American versions of modernism. So many American authors who are considered modernists actually left the United States. So they saw the U.S. as a really anti-intellectual place, rife with just really low culture. A lot of stuff that people still say about Americans today, these sort of stereotypes of Americans as stupid and racist and xenophobic and all this stuff. Modernists often were expats because they wanted to be part of a culture that they saw as more worldly, more urbane, more less provincial than what they saw American culture as being. So so American modernists on the other hand, so many left the country, but what they were also doing was creating a new vernacular, a new way of speaking. So modernism was there were a lot of manifestos written about how to make things new. So one of them was called The Revolution of the Word, which I'll read you guys a little bit from, if I can find it. Here we go. All right, so this was not specifically American, but it was signed by Americans, Hart Crane, for example. So, some of the things that the Revolution of the Word said that I think are good examples of what modernists wanted to do. The revolution in the English language is an accomplished fact. The imagination in search of a fabulous world is autonomous and unconfined. The literary creator has the right to disintegrate the primal matter of words imposed on him by textbooks and dictionaries. He has the right to use words of his own fashioning and to disregard existing grammatical and syntactical laws. We are not concerned with the propagation of sociological ideas except to emancipate the creative elements from the present ideology. The writer expresses, he does not communicate. The plain reader be damned. So this real concern with altering language itself. Okay. So, what was I going to say? There's like one other thing. Oh, so another thing you want to keep in mind about modernism is that a lot of modernist art was self-reflexive, meaning that it was very much concerned with its own identity as a piece of art. So although most art, like for all time, has dealt on some level with the idea that, or like has dealt with itself, right? So like I could write a poem that's like about writing a poem. So the author to her book, that's self-reflexive because it's a poem about poems. But modernism took it to like a new level, and was super concerned with its own nature as art and with its questioning of previous traditions of literature. So modernism is very much in conversation with like what came before, and that's why when you look at something like The Wasteland, which we're going to read next week, there's just like endless like footnotes of like, okay, here's this myth that's being referenced and this myth and like this thing about Christianity. So the ideal reader for a modernist was somebody who was like really highly educated. That's why they say the plain reader be damned, right? Like if you don't somehow know all of this Christian myth and all of this Greek myth and like maybe you know Latin, whatever. It was, they didn't sell a lot of books basically. They were hard to read, but you know, we're gonna read them. Other things that happened at this time. I think we can probably, so the Harlem Renaissance was also like a really important aspect of what was going on at this time, but I've sort of got a week for that on its own, so I'm not going to address it yet. So I'll turn to the Williams, and I guess it's already been 20 minutes. So I guess we'll start with the Williams, and then we'll do some HD, and then I'll stop talking into the void here. Okay. So we'll start with Williams, who was a modernist poet from New Jersey. Williams and HD were both associated with the movement of Imagism. So Imagism was concerned with the image, obviously, and you'll need to know this. This is like a term you should know. So Imagism sought clarity of expression through the use of precise images. And if you look at these poems, you can really see the shift of like, they are not telling you anything, they are showing you stuff. So T.S. Eliot was who said, show don't tell. And if you look at the poem A Sort of Song, William Carlos Williams said, no ideas but in things. So Imagism was very much concerned with showing you stuff, suggesting things to you without telling you exactly what they mean. So Imagism and modernism more broadly asked more of its reader than a lot of the work that came before it. So the reader was really expected to like add meaning to these works. So let's see. The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. So I wish we were all in class so I could ask you guys what does depend on this wheelbarrow, and what you notice about the language here. It's obviously a lot simpler, and the whole poem is based on one image. So you could really, like, you could draw this, you know, it's just one concrete image. If you look at criticism of this poem, like critics, not like people saying it's bad, but just, you know, people theorizing about this poem, there's a reading that says that what depends upon the wheelbarrow is agrarian American culture. So the wheelbarrow is a symbol of life on American farms. I think that is absolutely a valid reading and an interesting one, but I don't know. I don't think it's right personally. I think that's kind of reading too much into it. I'm also not like the only person who thinks this. So to me, this poem is not about the wheelbarrow like specifically, but rather about the image itself. So what depends on the wheelbarrow is, like, to me what he's really saying is, like, so much depends on the image. So much depends on the way that we perceive a moment. So if you picture yourself, like, with this wheelbarrow in this yard, looking at this rainy wheelbarrow, everything about your experience of that moment depends on the presence of the wheelbarrow and the rain and the white chickens. So yeah, so that's what I think. That's my reading. All right. A sort of song. Let the snake wait under his weed, and the writing be of words, slow and quick, sharp to strike, quiet to wait, sleepless. Through metaphor to reconcile the people and the stones. Compose. No ideas but in things. Invent. Saxifrage is my flower that splits the rocks. Okay, so this poem is kind of, this is self-reflexive. This is about what Williams sees as the role of the poet. So the way you should write is by letting the snake wait under his weed, and the writing should be slow and quick, sharp to strike, quiet to wait, sleepless. And there's a paradox there with slow and quick. Through metaphor to reconcile the people and the stones, which I think means that metaphor, which often, or always, usually depends on an image. Metaphor is what can bridge the gap between people and things. And then he says, no ideas but in things. Invent. The role of the artist is to be inventive and to make things new. Saxifrage is a flower that literally does split rocks. The name of that flower is like Latin for splitting rocks, or possibly just splitting. So if you imagine the saxifrage as representative of the poet, then the poet's role is to break through, like, whatever holds them back, whatever stiff societal structures are in place, represented here by the rocks. Let's see. All right, so I think I'm gonna hop to HD, and then I guess like next time I will do the rest of the Williams, because I do want to talk a little bit about HD today, because we didn't have a presentation, but you have the notes on Moodle, which I would like you to read. Those will be your understanding of HD, so please do read those. And you can also ask questions in those forums if you have any. All right. 21 to 22. I think I'm just going to do Helen today, and then I'll wrap it up. All right. So, you have your presentation on HD, so I'm not going to go over her life or anything, but I would just mention that she is one of my favorite poets. I love HD. I think she's so good. So, you know, I hope you guys also love her. Helen. All Greece hates the still eyes in the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands, and the white hands. All grace reviles the wan face when she smiles, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. Grace sees unmoved God's daughter, born of love, the beauty of cool feet and slenderous knees. Could love indeed the maid only if she were laid white ash amid funereal cypresses. Okay. So this poem is in conversation with Greek myth, which you'll see again and again. That's like what modernists do. We'll talk about Landscape with the Fall of Icarus next week from William Carlos Williams. That's also a poem that deals with myth. So Helen, well, we have our footnote, so you can see here. In Greek legend, the wife of Menelaus, her kidnapping by the Trojan prince Paris started the Trojan War. She was the daughter of the god Zeus, the product of his rape when disguised as a swan of the mortal Leda. And we're going to look at the poem Leda next time. So Helen of Troy was, in the myth, the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris wanted her for himself. So he kidnapped her and took her to Troy, and then there was a war. This is what the Iliad is about, if you've ever read the Iliad or heard of it, about the Trojan War, which wasn't real. That's a story. Although there might have been a war that would be, like, obviously gods didn't fight in it, as they do in the Iliad, but there may or may not have been something akin to the Trojan War. So, yeah. So this is kind of a new perspective on Helen. And what I love about this poem, and what I love about H.D. generally, is that she rewrites these myths that have always been about women, and she kind of shows a new perspective. So she's not necessarily taking Helen's perspective here, but I think in some ways she's at least sympathizing with Helen, because she, started this war, and it wasn't her fault, but everyone in Greece hates her because how many people died in that war. So modernism was like a pretty misogynistic movement. Nathaniel West, I'm pretty sure it was, 90% sure, you can, I guess, Google this if you want, but Nathaniel West once said of some of the female modernist fiction writers that all they needed was a good rape. There were a lot of modernist men who did not like the idea that women were writing at the time and being part of their movement. T.S. Eliot had a lot of anxieties about the idea of women as having intellectual autonomy, and even the modernists who did, respect H.D., respect Marianne Moore, and sort of engage with them, they saw these women as exceptions to the rule that women in general should not be taking part in intellectual life. And the other thing about modernism is that in T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, he kind of lays out a vision for what modernist poetry should look like and how it should be, and he saw modernism as a reaction to Romantic and Victorian poetry, which he saw as too feminine because it had too much ornamental language and too much emotion. So the very aesthetic root of modernism was a move toward a more masculine aesthetic, an aesthetic that was about, that wasn't expressing yourself and expressing your feelings, which I actually think, if you look at poetry today, I think a lot of it is still heavily influenced by this idea. I don't think you see as much poetry that's, I guess, got flowery language the way a lot of the Romantic poetry did. So anyway, H.D. kind of takes this idea of a stripped down, more masculine aesthetic, and she repurposes it to talk about Helen of Troy. So this is a blazon, is the form, which is a very old form of poetry in which the poet went through all the different body parts of a woman, saying like how like lovely she was, whatever. And the blazon is a little bit dehumanizing to the woman who's being written about, because it turns her not only into just an object for aesthetic admiration, but it also like fragments her body, right? So she no longer is like this unified whole of like a person in a body, like a mind, soul, whatever. She's just like different body parts. So HD uses this somewhat ironically here, I think. So we start with the still eyes and the white face, the white hands, the wan face when she smiles, the beauty of cool feet and slenderous knees. So these aren't stereotypically like hot body parts, you know, and even for like old blazons, right? They may talk more like hair, lips type of thing. I think it's really interesting that she actually moves down to like from face to knees and feet, which is kind of interesting. I think the line "Greece sees unmoved, God's daughter born of love" really reveals to us HD's sympathy for Helen of Troy, because she was the daughter of Zeus. She was born of a rape, but that's how it went down in Greek mythology all the time, really. And so the way I think that HD phrases this kind of shows the way in which she feels bad for Helen of Troy, because not only was Helen like, you know, kidnapped, she also was then blamed for this war that she had absolutely nothing to do with. She had no agency in that situation. So in a way, her beauty was a curse, or actually, I think in all ways, her beauty was a curse. And women are usually told, especially at this time, you know, women are sort of questioning their role and like moving toward more liberation, but had traditionally been told all they were there to do was be beautiful. And so HD shows how beauty can actually be dangerous for a woman and can ruin her life, and not only ruin her life, but in this case it ruined 2 cities. Let's see. So the only way that the Greeks could possibly love Helen, the only way the Greeks could possibly love Helen is if she were dead. So could love indeed the maid only if she were laid white ash amid funereal cypresses. So that would be like a funeral pyre. And this would have been particularly tragic for Helen, because she, you know, she was from Sparta. Like, she was married to a Spartan. That was her home. That was her homeland. Like, we call her Helen of Troy because Paris was Trojan and kidnapped her in the story, but that's not where she was from. So this is her homeland. These are like her people. And they've all turned against her. So really, she has no one in the world who she can trust. The middle stanza, I think, is a slightly more interesting take on Helen's like motivations and personality. So, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. So wan is when somebody looks really tired or sick, maybe like pale. But I guess I just wonder, like, what past enchantments and past ills she's remembering. And I also like this because HD is giving her an inner life here, right? Like in most in most stories of Helen, it's just her outer beauty that matters. She's outwardly beautiful, thus she gets kidnapped, then there's a war. But in this poem we see Helen remembering past enchantments and past ills. She has her own intellect, her own stuff that she thinks about. Okay, so I think that probably wraps it up for us. I would say the key terms you should be thinking about for that we learned today: Imagism, Modernism, the Blazon, and yeah, that'll probably do it. All right. Well, thanks for coming to my video lecture. I might try to figure out a way to either get Zoom or, I don't know, try to figure out a way to do this like more live so you guys can ask questions during. See if anyone's answered the discussion questions. The internet's really slow. Oh, cool. Okay, so we do some discussion answers. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to get off this video situation and, well, no, you know what? I'll answer them in the video because that's what class time is for, right? Let's see. All right. So Carl, I really like what you said about these poems being like much easier to read than the ones assigned before, but still hard to understand. So, like, as we talked about, I really do think it's okay if you don't read like way too much into it. I think a lot of times imagist poetry is about the image. So the Plum poem, this is just to say, I think that's really like just about the image, which we'll talk about next time. Let's see. Deja, I really like what you said about mass media being beneficial to society. I totally agree with that, right? So I think that's part of the problem with modernist art. Many modernists were really like elitist and also highly educated and rich, you know, like this, we don't like to talk about it, but like most of the famous people who we read, like they had money, you know, it takes money to be able to just like chill in your house writing all the time and like go to Paris and go live there, whatever, you know, like you need money to do that. So I think part of what modernists didn't like about mass media is that they saw people with like less education having access to books and stuff like that. But that's actually like a really good thing for society, right? Like you want the masses of people to be able to read and like enjoy art. And you know, a lot of the mass media at this time was stuff like detective fiction, stuff that is actually, you know, probably worthy of looking at as art that's important. I mean, you know, it wasn't modernism, but the fact that Agatha Christie was a woman writing detective stories, like that's still important. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying a lot of here is that these poems are shorter. They're definitely shorter. And their simplicity, as Ashley said, makes them feel more complicated. So I'm glad that you guys are all getting that, right? So this idea that you're adding the meaning to the poem yourself. I feel like everyone's seeing how that kind of worked, and that's important. That's like that's what the authors want you to do. So you, although you're confused and you feel like you have to make all the meaning here and fill in the blanks, like you're reading it right. So don't feel bad about that. That is what these authors expect of their audiences, and that's like the feeling and uncertainty that they want you to be experiencing. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm going to go through this discussion, see if I can answer a few more things in text. And yeah, have a great day. Wash your hands. I'll see you next week.